Hello and welcome to The Bottom Line here on TVP World. This is where we unpack some of the main business and economic stories of the day. I'm your host, Marie Cato. Monday this week brought news of the EU and Ukraine striking a preliminary trade deal, one that is considered realistic but less ambitious. EU Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič describes this agreement as the best possible outcome under difficult geopolitical conditions. To understand what this will entail for EU and Ukrainian farmers and broader European trade, let's go to Jan Kennedy's report.
After a weekend of intense negotiations, EU Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič announced that the bloc had brokered a new trade deal with Ukraine.
Today's agreement in principle is balanced, fair and realistic. It represents the best possible outcome under difficult geopolitical conditions. Politically, this is a strong signal of steadfast support to Ukraine as it defends its sovereignty and democratic future. And crucially, it is also a response to concerns voiced by our member states, farmers and food producers.
It comes 3 weeks after the expiration of the special treatment the EU had granted Ukraine's agri-food exports since the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion in 2022. While the details of the deal remain confidential, the EU ensured that the new quotas would address previous market disturbances. This means that quotas for products like wheat, eggs or sugar are to be set below recently seen peak levels. Less sensitive products like butter, skimmed milk powder, oats, barley and malt will see their quotas adjusted to historic highs. Meanwhile, products considered low risk, such as milk powder, fermented milk, mushrooms and grape juice, will enjoy full liberalisation. Ukraine, in turn, has agreed to increase quotas for pork, poultry and sugar imports, as well as cut tariffs on a range of other goods. It has also agreed to comply with the EU agricultural standards, including pesticide use, by 2028. However, the preliminary deal still requires approval from EU member states, and some of them had previously blocked the free flow of Ukrainian exports amidst widespread farmer protests over cheap Ukrainian goods flooding the domestic market and undercutting local producers. But Šefčovič is confident these concerns have now been addressed.
I believe that once these explanations are done and when we move in the process of finalizing the formal approval of this agreement, that there will be also positive reaction to lift these embargoes also from our member states.
In the event of a major market disruption, however, individual members will still be able to restrict imports of certain goods.
The immediate reaction to news of the EU and Ukraine reaching a preliminary trade deal might be one of relief, perhaps a signal that some level of calm and order is being re-established. Or will this become a new source of tension for European businesses and farmers? We're now joined by Professor Jan Hagemejer, international trade expert at the University of Warsaw and president of the board of CASE, a Polish think tank. Hello, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good afternoon.
So let's begin with how the key provisions of this trade deal compare to the previous setup. How will it avoid the previous market disturbances?
So it always depends, which set of provisions we're talking about, because there were two sets of provisions. One is the DCFTA, or the Deep Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement that was signed almost 10 years ago and went into effect in 2016, which was quite similar to the one that we are having now, which envisages partial liberalization of imports from Ukraine, partial access of Ukrainian agri-food products to the Polish market, where there are the so-called tariff rate quotas. Tariff rate quotas work in a way that you have a special quota, a number of units of a particular good, let's say wheat, that you can import tariff-free, and then once you hit the threshold, we start applying the tariff, which in general means that only the allotted quota is more competitive than the usual tariff that is applied. But then, from 2022, we had another piece of provisions, which was more, so to say, an emergency set of provisions that was introduced to help Ukraine in the war effort, and also to, so to say, overcome the barriers of trade that were introduced by the ongoing war. And they actually introduced, the EU actually introduced completely free imports from Ukraine to EU countries. But what it means is that even though the current provisions are slightly more liberal than the DCFTA, they provide quite a bit of reintroduction of protection of the EU markets compared to the provisions that we had up until June this year.
So do you think that this will actually appease the EU's agricultural bloc? You say partial liberalization, but by the looks of it, there's going to be quite a lot of access for the Ukrainians.
Yes, there are some products which were actually mentioned in the material that were sort of granted tariff-free access. This, fortunately, does not, to a large extent, apply to the products that are the most sensitive products in Poland. The ones that Polish farmers are so much afraid about, like the imports of wheat, for example, are still subject to a quota, and we don't expect this quota to be much larger than the one that we had in the original DCFTA. So, yeah.
But we see that Ukraine won't gain a blanket tariff-free access that it enjoyed during the war, but the new terms actually raise the quotas for many products that weren't previously liberalized. So it does really seem that the terms of this trade deal, obviously they haven't been finalized, and it's obviously subject to both sides agreeing to it, but it does seem that this new agreement will allow for Ukrainian farmers, well, just the market, to gain a lot of access to the EU market.
Well, I would say that there are three things that have to be taken into consideration. First, more access, lower prices. The consumer is going to be more satisfied or more happy with the lower prices. The European consumer. Provided, of course,
what about the European farmer?
Well, but that's, I mean, in trade policy, usually there is a little bit of a clash of interest between the consumer and the farmers, and usually the consumers are much more numerous than the farmers. Therefore, if you consider just the classic approach to the trade policy, the farmers are the one benefited, a small group that is benefited by the protection, but the consumers are not. They are harmed by the protection in general. So that's one consideration, and I think that's the main consideration that is taken into account by the European Commission, in particular with food prices that are going up quite quickly over the last few years. So that's one point. Second point is that you cannot just access the EU market, because you still have to adhere to the EU sanitary and phytosanitary regulations.
But is Ukraine actually meeting those standards? Because their deadline is 2028.
That's true, but still, I mean, you have checks, random checks of the goods that come in, and if they are not in line with the EU regulation, they cannot be allowed the access to the EU. There might be products that would, get under the threshold, but this should not be the rule rather than an exception. And then you have so that's basically at the product level, you have controls of the quality of the products, but at the same time, what this means, this adjustment of Ukraine's regulation, is that Ukraine is going to commit to actually harmonize their regulations concerning the agri-food products, so that everything that's produced in Ukraine would actually be harmonized with the EU regulations. And this is an important step for the future accession of Ukraine to the EU. Obviously,
it lies in Ukraine's interests to meet those standards. But would you say that Ukraine has come a little bit closer to meeting those standards than perhaps since 2021, since 2022?
Oh well, unfortunately, I don't know the data on that. I mean, there are usually data on the percentage of products that are rejected, but unfortunately, I'm not aware of the actual numbers. But for sure, I mean, if the Ukrainian farmers and the Ukrainian policymakers are expecting EU accession in some reasonable time, this harmonization would have to take place, in particular, as it is easier for the producers to adhere to one set of regulations rather than two different sets of regulations, the Ukrainian one and the EU one. This also happened in Poland in the 1990s.
But obviously Poland had access to funds in order to meet those standards to move forward. Where would you say that Ukraine actually stands in terms of the disparity, in terms of the standards that it meets or perhaps doesn't meet in terms of EU standards?
To be very honest, I don't know precisely, but in terms of the grain exports and the grains production, I would say that Ukrainian grains production is much more advanced than the Polish grain production. That's why it's so productive. And it's not only because we expect that these grains are of low standards, but also because this production is done at a huge scale. And this scale brings economies of scale that allows it to be very, very productive. Also, Ukraine has one of the best soils for wheat in Europe.
But nonetheless, if we're looking at things very bluntly, at the end of the day, there is produce that is coming in from Ukraine that is below EU standard.
We don't know that.
We don't know that.
I mean,
they don't meet the regulations, though.
Well, once again, the local regulations concern the supplies of their products to the domestic market. But the producers that export to the EU can voluntarily meet the EU regulations in order to supply the product to the EU markets without a problem. I mean, if you are a huge company that tries to establish a big market in the EU, then it would be in your interest to actually go ahead and meet those regulations, right?
Okay, so there might be individual suppliers that actually meet those standards.
Of course.
So is this perhaps a situation where the European market has got used to cheaper input, a cheaper influx of produce?
It might have got used to that. In fact, I mean.
So the New Deal is a way of securing cheaper produce, essentially.
But if you think about
higher food prices.
Well, if you think about the food sector, the food processing sector, of course, I mean, this is at the level of their inputs. I mean, there are many other costs that are rising at the same time with the potential access to the cheaper products from Ukraine. So, I mean, from the point of view of a food processing company, it would be optimal to source the goods from the cheapest producer, provided that the quality is good enough, right?
The trade deal suggests that member states in the EU are supporting this next step as a means of Ukraine becoming a member of the EU. Mm-hmm. But there is obviously some tension because Hungary and Poland have banned some Ukrainian imports, and now the understanding is that they're supposed to lift those bans.
Yes. I mean, of course.
Do you know what products are in question?
Well, I think this is mainly the grains that are affected by this. But of course, there was also one other thing that in the material that you have prepared was the safeguards that we haven't talked about yet, right? Yes. The safeguards that allow a temporary halt of imports.
In case of an emergency.
In case of an emergency or a destabilization of the market.
What would that look like?
Well, I mean, you've got when a case like that happens, basically you have sudden imports that would lead to a large decrease in prices, and that would make the domestic farmers not able to sell their products because it's either because the domestic prices are not satisfactory to them and they are not willing to do that, right? So that's the main issue. So if you observe that suddenly the imports from a particular country go up by, let's say, 100-200%, then you do impose or ask the European Commission for a permission to impose such a ban on imports or a high tariff on imports. But in general, when we look at those quotas, in particular, quotas are imposed on all the sensitive products in the EU. So those where we sort of are afraid of those of such a destabilization. These quotas are not particularly large, in particular in comparison to the production of the EU, the production of Poland, and so on and so on. And of course, one reason why a government might choose to introduce a ban, which is another story and more of a long-term story, is the so-called political economy of trade policy, where farmers are a big part of the electorate and a big part of the voting power. And this is also why the farmers are so protected in the EU.
Well, I don't know. I think the farmers don't feel that they're protected in the EU. I think they feel quite neglected.
Let's look at the Polish examples. I mean, all the objective studies say that the Polish farmers have been a group in Poland that was by far the most benefited by the EU accession.
The accession, but I'm talking about recent years. I think overall we've seen the farmers protesting across Europe.
Yes, but I wouldn't say that this is much different from farmers protesting 10 years ago and 20 years ago.
But we've been talking about Ukraine accessing the European market. What are the European farmers gaining from this trade deal?
Well, but not everybody is gaining from the trade deal. The whole point of the trade deal is that you try to benefit the industries that you think are the ones where you have comparative advantage, which means that these are your export sector and export sectors, and in a way you reduce the role of the others. And if you think about farming in the EU, the reason that farming in the EU is so large is only because of the protection, not because we are so good at producing food. We are not good at producing food. I mean, the rest of the world is much better at producing food than us.
Than the EU?
Yes.
Just as we wrap up, we also have the Merkasur EU deal. Just very, very briefly, how will that work in parallel with this new EU-Ukraine treaty deal? Because obviously Merkasur also evokes a lot of skepticism.
Yes, but compared to, I believe that compared to the involvement of EU trade with Ukraine, Merkasur is a much smaller phenomenon. We actually did a simulation of that. Of the whole exercise at case 3 years ago, and now we actually have redone it, and the macroeconomic effects are very small. And even if you look at the impact on the production of agricultural goods and food products in the EU countries, the results are minimal. So they are of course negative because we are increasing import competition. But they are less than 1% of output, so they are very small. And at the same time, you have huge gains in the manufacturing industry. So that's what trade is all about. You try to benefit the sectors where you actually do have comparative advantage, and that's the EU industry and services, while trying not to destroy at the same time the agriculture and food, because this is important for your food security. Right? But I mean, if you take the food security aside, the farming industry is a concept in Europe that is not, it does not have much of a comparative advantage, in particular in the very simple goods like commodities like wheat, which can be produced in very many places in the world. If you think about more value-added intensive products, some special fruit or some sophisticated vegetables or some sophisticated meat, of course, the profitability of doing that in the EU is higher. But in terms of wheat and other very simple and replaceable products, the reason why there is so much of a production in Europe is because we have chosen to do that.
Okay.
We have chosen to protect.
Professor Jan Hagemejer, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you.
And that concludes The Bottom Line for today. I was your host, Marie Cato. We bring you the best of regional business Monday to Friday at 5:10 CET on TVP World. And in the meantime, for the latest in regional business, follow us on X and on tvpworld.com. And for more news and analysis, stay with us on TVP World. Goodbye.